Okay, so the final unit in this course is Macroeconomics. It's Unit 10. Think big picture. All right, the two key words to start off with: imports and exports. Import is goods that you bring into your country from another country, a foreign country. Exports is the goods that you sell to a foreign country. So you import food and you export food, if that's the way to remember it. Not necessarily the best way to remember it. One of the earliest economic concepts that we followed in this country was mercantilism, which basically says that you should sell more goods to a foreign country than what you buy from a foreign country. It's a great idea, and it worked for a period of time. The problem is that we are very globally interdependent with other countries. In other words, countries can make things or offer things, goods and services, sometimes cheaper than what we can actually make or offer in this country. So we do have sometimes a trade imbalance. What we want to try to do is have a trade advantage. An absolute advantage is when we are able to produce more than another country. A comparative advantage is that we can make more or offer more than another country for a lot cheaper opportunity costs. We can do it more efficiently. Some countries we have a absolute advantage with. Some countries we only have a comparative advantage with. In this state, we are very big with manufacturing. We're very big with agriculture. So for us at a state level, we have an advantage in those two areas. As a country, I can't say that we have a specific good or service that we can offer better than another country can. So what we're going to have is comparative advantages with other countries versus an absolute advantage. What gives us advantages as a country or as a state is technology or access to technology. Also natural resources. You either have them or you don't. And then of course the government can regulate the economy that gives us an advantage. So trade restrictions or trade sanctions can play a role in getting an advantage with another country. So putting tariffs on goods from foreign countries. A tariff is a fancy word for a tax. Putting a trade sanction, an embargo. Trade sanction is when you, the individual country, do not trade with another country. An embargo is when you, the country, or several other countries combined, do not trade with a specific country. Establishing quotas. We can only buy a certain number of products from a certain country, can give us an advantage economically over that country. Adam Smith thought this would be a bad idea because he's all about mercantilism, laissez-faire economics. Karl Marx believed that the government should play a key role in the economy. Adam Smith, no. He wanted the government to be out of the economy, allow people to freely make the best decision, and they would make the best decision, but human nature says that's not going to happen. Trade agreements, pros and cons. Trade agreements eliminate tariffs, such as NAFTA, which is the trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. We freely trade goods between the countries. There's no tariffs. That's good because it lowers prices. It's bad because then if a country like Mexico can make it cheaper than an American company, then we lose those jobs. We're not buying enough of the American products. Ultimately, what we're looking at as a consumer is what's the quality of the item and how much it's going to cost us, not necessarily where it's coming from. So what we want to see is expansion in our economy as a country. Unfortunately, there are going to be times where we have too much expansion, and this would lead to inflation. Inflation is when prices of goods and services go up, but your income does not go up with it. In other words, you can't afford to buy the basic things that you need to survive. A recession is when we see a slowdown in the economy. And if it's a severe enough recession or an extended period of recession, we can then lead to what is called a depression. The last depression we had was the Great Depression, roughly from about 1929 to roughly 1939, 1941. We saw a major economic depression. We had a lot of people unemployed. Banks closed the doors. People lost their life savings. And it just was a horrible circumstance. And then we elect FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, in 1932. He brings in his New Deal programs, his legislation, and we slowly start to recuperate from this depression. Of course, it took us to be involved in World War II to really get us out of this lengthened recession, i.e. a depression. Now, how can we prevent another depression, or how can we determine if we're heading toward a recession or a depression? We can look at the GDP, the gross domestic product. And this is a measure in value of American dollars of all the goods and services that we produce in a single year. If our GDP goes up from one year to the next, we can say that we're doing relatively okay. We're maybe getting out of a recession or heading away from a recession. We can look at the unemployment rate. Ideally, if we can keep it under 5-6%, we're doing pretty good. If we're around 8, 9, possibly 10%, we're maybe heading into a recession. You can look at the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and this is basically looking at the actual price of goods and services. If it's increasing, that could be a bad sign. We could definitely see possibly heading into an inflationary economy. Cost of living or standard of living. We're looking at, can the average person with the average income of an American survive from month to month? So what can we do to fix the economy? Well, we can do things such as monetary policy. Monetary policy is all about controlling two things basically. The flow of money, which is done by the Federal Reserve System, or controlling the interest rates, which is also done by the Federal Reserve System, otherwise known as the Fed. The Fed controls the circulation of money, so they're the ones that ask for the printing of money done through the Department of Treasury. Remember, the Fed is the bank's bank. So like BB&T, First Citizen, those are commercial banks. They get their money from the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve tells them how much interest to charge whenever they are handing out loans. But they're also the government's bank as well. So that things like savings bonds, those are done through the Federal Reserve. That's the bank's bank and the government's bank. The Federal Reserve Chairman basically decides how much money should be circulating, the reserve requirement. They also determine interest rates. So if the Fed raises interest rates, which they recently did this month in December, that means that they're trying to slow down the economy slightly. Maybe we're getting out of a recession and potentially could be heading to an inflationary economy. We could also use fiscal policy, which is about government spending and taxation. So if the government raises taxes, that means that they're trying to slow down consumers. They're trying to get us to spend less. If the government decides to spend more money on government programs, they're trying to stimulate the economy, maybe to keep us out of a recession. So it's all about speeding up and slowing down the economy. Recession's bad, inflation's bad. What we want is sort of a roller coaster effect, but without a whole lot of major going up and major going down. The government can also control the economy through the government's budget, how much money they spend. Preferably, we'd love to have a government surplus. More than likely, we're going to have a government deficit. And this leads to the national debt. Right now, the current national debt is getting close to $18 trillion. We are spending a lot of money. And a part of that is because of mandatory spending. Mandatory spending is money that should be spent required by law. So these are entitlement programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, basically welfare programs. Discretionary spending is spending on federal bureaucracy programs such like NASA. The government can cut back on NASA's funding because maybe they want to save money because they don't want the debt to keep going up. Most of our spending comes from mandatory spending, entitlement programs, and also national defense, which is discretionary spending. And where do we get the money from? Where does the government get the money from? Taxation. Two absolutes in the world, death and taxes. You're going to pay taxes as long as you're breathing. So there's different types of taxes. We have progressive taxes. The more you make, the more you pay to the government, state or federal. This would be an example of income tax. Then we have what's called a proportional tax, sometimes called a flat tax in a way. It's based on a percentage. The best example would be property tax. The more valuable your property is, the more taxes you're going to pay on that property. If you don't own any property, well, you're not going to have to pay taxes on that. A regressive tax would be a sales tax. This typically impacts people with less income versus people who have a higher income, because you're going to pay the same tax rate. So if it's a 6% sales tax, 7% sales tax, it doesn't matter if you're earning $150,000 a year or $100,000 a year or $50,000 or $25,000 a year. You're all going to pay the same sales tax when you buy that product. So when it comes to ways to control spending, it comes from having to cut our discretionary spending and also potentially having to raise taxes, but no one likes the idea of raising taxes. So what else is involved in macroeconomics? The stock market. Remember, you did the stock market simulation. We're talking about the New York Stock Exchange. We're talking about Wall Street. And the actual value of stocks determines the health of our economy, which in fact determines the value of our money, because money was once based on gold. The value of gold, unfortunately, that changed under the Nixon administration when he signed into law that we would no longer be on the gold standard. Now it's based on the health of the economy, i.e. what's going on in the stock market, what's going on in unemployment, what's going on with the GDP, the CPI. Those are all things that are going to determine how successful we are as a country, and of course how successful we can be individually in this country economically. Another thing to think about with macroeconomics is the employees. Labor unions. Labor unions are there to protect the rights of workers. Unfortunately, a drawback of a labor union would be if there's a dispute between the labor union and the business owners, they could go on strike the workers. Sometimes the owners of the business may lock out the employees because they don't agree with the contract that was signed with the workers. What you try to do to avoid these circumstances is to go into mediation, where you have a third party come in to negotiate a compromise, or arbitration, where you have someone with legal experience to actually determine what the contract should be between the company and the workers. We do have labor unions in this state, but we are a right-to-work state, which means that you cannot be forced to join a labor union in order to get a job with a specific business. State employees are not allowed to form labor unions. A lot of times that happens in right-to-work states. They limit the access of government employees to forming labor unions to negotiate better pay or better working conditions. So North Carolina is one of several states